My name is Mike Amundsen. As you've already heard, this is my first visit to Perth. I'm very excited. It's my first visit to Bank West. It's been an amazing several days. The kind of work they're doing here is really quite incredible, so it's very exciting. Bank West has been a really great host. I live in Kentucky in the United States. How many people have been to Kentucky? One person, me. Anyway, what do we know about Kentucky? Chicken, right? Chicken, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry about that, but yeah, chicken. Next, what else? Bourbon, my favorite part. Horses too, but you know, that's another thing. We race a little bit in Kentucky, but bourbon is really the thing. The only problem is I really like bourbon a lot, and so I get to be like kind of a bourbon snob, like if that's possible. I think it is, but then that means it's always really expensive here, right? So I really want, I want that other thing that's like really rare in US and it got shipped all the way here, so it's really expensive. But I enjoy it a lot. So this is me. This is how you find me. This is the best way to figure out where I am, is to actually just look on Twitter or GitHub and LinkedIn. I travel a lot, so I'm here this week. I landed on Sunday. I'll leave on Saturday to fly to Lyon, France for the web conference, Worldwide Web Conference. Be there for a week. I get to stay home for a week. And then I fly to South America for a week. Then I go to Copenhagen for a week. That's kind of my life. Last year, I was traveling somewhere 40 weeks last year. That's too much. I'm cutting back. I'm going for like 35. I promise. But I get to meet so many really interesting people in so many fantastic places. It's a great job. I work in a group that's called the API Academy. I'm just going to talk about them briefly because they co-sponsored a lot of my travel. API Academy is a group of sort of researchers. They sometimes use the word thought leaders that are based in lots of locations, in London and Zurich and Silicon Valley and Vancouver, and I'm the one that's in Kentucky. And we travel around, all of them travel around like I do. We get to meet organizations, collect up ideas, and share that back. The last big project we completed was a book on microservices about a year ago, where we got a chance to talk to companies like Netflix and Google and Amazon and SoundCloud and Uber and all these other organizations to figure out what they're doing and how they're doing it. So that's a chance to share that. So we have a website. If you just look up API Academy, you'll find it. So it's a great place to collect information, and a lot of the things that I'm going to share today are things that we've learned in lots of other companies around the world as well. So this is my chance to share with you, and this is a chance for us to just kind of talk. So I want to do something a little bit unusual. This isn't going to be a really techie talk. It's not going to be, I don't have any URLs or anything like this in it. But a lot of people that I work with are trying to figure out how to create great APIs, how to create great interfaces to their business, to their services. Some of the customers I work with are actually in competition in a market, like in third parties, to attract developers to their APIs. It's very much a market-driven business, so they're trying to figure out how to do that. So they talk a lot about what's good, what's great, what's usable, what's functional, how can we make this better. And I remember a book from a long time ago about business management called Good to Great. And these characteristics that James Collins had about what companies are great and why they're great. How do they get from just being good to actually being better? And I thought, well, I'd like to go back and relook at those things and see if those kinds of lessons, those kinds of characteristics can maybe be applied in the same kind of way. So this is James Collins. James has written several books. James looks pretty severe in most of his publicity photos, but he is apparently a pretty friendly guy. And he spent a bunch of time, he's from Harvard Business School and all these other things, and he spent a lot of time on this idea about what is it about certain characteristics of a business or certain characteristics of a group of people that actually make it rise above in some kind of way. So he wrote this book, and he wrote this book, I think it was in the 80s, I can't quite remember. But he wrote about this idea of how you transition from good to great, how you get from one place to another, what would help people kind of identify whether or not you're actually on the path, you're actually going to pull this off. The secondary lesson in his book, though, is a little bit more concerning. It's how most people don't make it. So what are those unique things that actually make it possible? So I figured out, well, how can we do that? Can we apply some of his same ideas to this world of APIs? In many ways, many of my customers, for them, APIs are a product. APIs are a marketplace. APIs are a business imperative. They're not just a back office element. They're not just a way to reduce cost. They're a way to actually create opportunity. So it would seem to make sense if we can apply some of these same ideas. So Collins has these things he calls the 7 principles. Some of these may sound familiar. You may recognize them from some other source. I'm not going to go through them too much in detail, but he has this notion of level 5 leaders. This idea of you first figure out who you're dealing with and then what you're going to do. You confront brutal facts, which I thought was a really interesting one. You're actually brutally honest with yourself and everyone else, and that's how you actually start to get ahead. It's an interesting story. This is called the hedgehog concept. It's a little bit like the tortoise and hare story, the hedgehog and the fox. It's an old tale, and it turns out the hedgehog always wins. The hedgehog always outsmarts the fox. And why is that? And it's because the hedgehog has a real commitment, because if he loses, he dies. He's got a real passion for success. A culture of discipline. This is a pattern that I see in lots of companies that I visit. The ones that are really good, they're really good at doing the little things, or really good at doing the mundane things. And we'll talk about that. I love this idea, using technology to accelerate growth. For us, API space or in the IT space, we would say, oh, sure, of course you would. But he's got a really interesting point of view on this, which basically says using technology just for technology's sake is a disaster, is a big mistake. And it's hard for us sometimes to know, especially when we're in IT, to actually tell our business management or tell our leadership to say, you know what? It's not really a good idea to convert that or to spend time on that. We should leave that alone. Leave that legacy thing alone. We should do this over here instead. A lot of times, if we're given an opportunity to rebuild the same house again, we'd love to do it, right? As a matter of fact, what we'd first do is we'd actually destroy the old one, sort of like go Soviet. Like it never existed. That old version never existed. We just replaced a brand new one, right? We don't like a lot of history a lot of times. And then the last one, he talks about the flywheel. This comes up in a couple of other different cases. The idea of once you get started, once you get rolling, even if you can move it a little bit, it gets easier and easier and easier and easier. So this flywheel concept comes in really handy as well. So all these things about leadership and focus and discipline and all these other things all lead to what means greatness in Collins' eyes. So I thought maybe we can talk about this from just an API perspective. What do we need? How does it work? What does that look like? And the first thing I think about is developers. We hear these stories about 10x developers or full stack developers or hero developers or all these other things. We have a kind of romantic notion about some developer that spends, like, they have no personal life, they do everything at work, and they're amazing people, and nobody understands how she pulls it off, but this stuff always works. And it turns out that's not really a good path to greatness. It actually is a path to somebody getting burned out, a company having a huge dependence on just a few heroic people, and those people often end up leaving because they don't have a balanced life. So what is a good developer? And this level 5 thing is actually pretty handy. I like the way Collins talks about what level 5 developers are. In essence, he talks about them as leaders, but he says they're people who are humble but driven to do what's best for the company. And there are lots of people that I get a chance to meet and talk to who work in these IT programs, these API programs, and they're really smart. And they're really, really intelligent, and they're also incredibly generous. And that usually is a sign that they work in a community where that kind of behavior is promoted, and they usually build some of the greatest stuff. They just work really hard, and they don't look for a lot of attention. And that's pretty amazing. When Collins talks about it, he talks about it as sort of your role in the organization. That in the beginning, like the level one is just it's a capable individual. This is somebody who does their job well, know what's going on, keep up with things. That's really great. At the next level is somebody who contributes to the team. Often it gets characterized as helping the team actually look great. Like, why, that's a great team. Why? I wonder what's going on there. At the next point in Collins' story is this idea of actually being a good manager, a good group manager. You actually not only help the team look good, but you actually help the team get better. You help the team figure out how to be really effective. And that's sort of the next level. You actually help more than just your team, but maybe your division or your group of people. And then finally, at a point where you're really able to help the organization improve in lots of different ways. And I've seen developers like this too, at each stage of this process. And usually the things they produce, as they get better, as they get higher up in this sort of stack that Collins talks about, the focus goes less and less on their own interests or their own skills, and more on their customers or their stakeholders or some other aspect. One of the keys to making something great and helping an organization get to be great is figuring out who your audience is. What is it that they really want? What is it that they really need? And there are lots of organizations that are pretty good at this. One company in particular that in IT space that has a lot of APIs that's pretty interesting is Spotify. Has anybody heard of the Spotify company? They spend a great deal of time focusing on how they can help their individuals move up that kind of stack. They don't talk about level 1 through 5 leaders, but they talk about this ability to contribute. And in their leadership material, they talk a lot about being humble as a leader. So I think they're a really great example if you're interested in how to build a community of developers, and not just in your own team, but cross-team. Spotify is a great example. And I think Spotify has a really good reputation as a good IT company, a good product company, and they do a lot of really interesting things in their program. So I would encourage you to check out Spotify. There's lots of stuff online. If you just say scaling Spotify, there's a series of articles about how they run their organization, how they get people to work in teams. So one of the things that Collins says about this particular aspect is it's about resolve and like determination. Like, I'm going to do what the company needs. I think all of us have probably experienced at one time or another that you've got the company in mind, but maybe some of your colleagues, some of your peers don't quite know that, and you have to kind of press on anyway. It gets frustrating when people don't listen. You know you're trying to help, but you can't quite get through. And the people who end up really good at this are able to get past that frustration and keep at it. I was having a conversation with somebody that I had met a few years ago when I was down here, and we were talking about how things get popular and things change and people move on, but there's always this feeling like, yeah, that's okay, they'll be back, they'll have the same set of problems, I'll be here, I'll be ready to help. So with that's a really big part of it. And that leads to the second thing. Well, another pattern that Collins talks about is in his list he says, first who, then what. And that's a really important rule. And the way he describes it is, get the right people on the bus first, then figure out where you're going to go. So really it's this notion that the people you have is actually more important than the direction you think you want to go. And in fact, the people you have will affect your journey, how you're going to get there. And that's a really powerful thing. It's very similar to the kind of things that Spotify talks about. And a company that's great at this, get the right people on the bus pattern, is Netflix. So Netflix has this reputation of spending a lot of time, they say, hiring from the top of the barrel, finding the right people. And so they have this thing about if somebody, if you, from a manager standpoint, if somebody was leaving, would you really fight to keep them? And if the answer is no, at Netflix they say, well, then you should probably help that person find another place in the organization, because they're not vital to what you're doing. Find people, get the right people, and then they'll help you figure out where to go. At Netflix, they also tell their managers, Your job is not to tell them what to do. Your job is to give them direction, give them some help, carry water, ask them what they need, because they're the experts. They're the ones who know what to do. So that's that same idea, first who, then what. And a big part of that, Colin says, is vision. You need to give your smart people a vision. They'd be happy to work on something powerful and fantastic if they had a sense that they knew where they were headed. So Netflix is a great example of this kind of element. And Netflix has, to even be more explicit about it, their last release of their whole API set was actually designed to improve the experience for users on every single device. They used to have a general API that all the devices used, PS2 and Xbox and Android and the browser and iPhone, they all used the same API. But Netflix realized that you didn't have a really good experience on every one. It was all kind of generic. It was kind of hard to get each one of those to really shine. So they went out and they built a custom-built interface API for every single device, sometimes even different versions of the same device, in order to make sure that that API experience was exactly fitting to the experience of programming on an iOS device or programming on the PS2. They actually created what they called experience APIs because they were really focused on this vision about how to make sure that they got just the right kind of experience on every device. So that really helps a lot. Confronting the brutal facts, this is one that's really hard, and it's a great differentiator. In the book, he talks about a thing called the Stockdale paradox. I'm not sure if a lot of people in the room would actually know who James Stockdale was. He was actually a Vietnam War prisoner of war, and he was in there for quite a long time, like 7 years. I think it's like 6 or 7 years. And he kept saying that he, in order to keep going, in order to keep his spirits up, he had to have faith that one day he'd be released, but he couldn't let that faith blind him from the brutal fact that he is currently a prisoner. So as long as he confronted the brutal facts every day, he could cope. But he said there were people who kept saying, well, next day we'll get released, or next day we'll get released, and they would get crushed over and over again. So confronting the brutal facts actually gives you power. It gives you this ability to do something about it. If you just ignore, if you just look at the bright side all the time, it doesn't work. I think one of the best examples of confronting the brutal facts came from a sort of an odd case, a random case by a guy by the name of Steve Yegge. Has anybody heard of the Yegge memo? The Yegge memo, this is a great experience. Steve Yegge was hired away from Amazon to go work at Google. And when he came to Google, Steve said that he was absolutely appalled at what he didn't find, what he thought was going on. And his experience at Amazon had told him that he should expect certain things that weren't there. So, and within the first week or two, first couple of weeks he was there, he sat down and wrote this rant, wrote this memo about how Google is in big trouble unless they start changing things. You've got to face facts. You're going to have your lunch handed to you by Amazon if you don't do the following things. And let me give you some examples. The funny thing was, Steve had only been there a few weeks. He didn't quite understand how inter-office services work. And what he did is he wrote it and clicked and sent it to his public Google Plus page. So everybody got to see it. What was even better is Google didn't fire him. Right? They said, you know what? You're right. You don't have to tell everybody else that, but you're right. So, and Steve has done this a couple of times before. Steve has now since left Google. I can't remember where he's gone next. I don't know if anybody can remind me. I think it was in the last year. Where is it? What's it? He's working on a game? Yeah. So even as he was leaving, he wrote another one of these messages to the company about what he likes about it, what he doesn't like about it, and he was also pretty brutal in that process. But Steve has done a great job of making that part of his superpower, part of his character, and it's become one of the things that helped the projects that he worked on at Google get really, really good. Because it's really based on this idea that unless you're brutally honest, you're really not going to be able to make good decisions. You're going to be sort of living in this dream kind of world. So creating great interfaces, great APIs, great products for companies really has a lot to do with this notion of being really honest. So the one that's most peculiar to me in reading Jim's book is this idea of the hedgehog. So there's a story about this hedgehog and this fox, and that the hedgehog is able to outsmart the fox. And it's primarily because the hedgehog has everything to lose, and the fox has not much to gain in their fight between them. So the way that Jim talks about it, he says there's this confluence of things. What is it that you're really passionate about? What do you think you can be best at in the world? Not just best at in this neighborhood, but what's going to make you really powerful, really unique? And what's the driving resource? What's the driving source of what you do? And this is a great way to think about products. This is a great way to think about what your organization has. What is your organization passionate about? What do you do that nobody else does? And paying attention to who pays your bills. How this is really going to pay off in the end. And he talks about this sort of confluence of these three things is actually that sweet spot. If you can operate inside that zone, nobody can beat you. One of the things we learned is we talked to lots of different companies about how they decide what's important and how they invest their time and energy. One of the things we saw over and over again is companies like Netflix and Amazon and Google and Microsoft and Facebook, they almost always have some investment in creating like an internal set of tools or an internal set of processes that really play on their biggest value or their biggest superpower or their biggest passion or principle. At Netflix, the most important thing for Netflix is that the system never go down, that when you're watching a show, you never get interrupted. It doesn't stop, you don't get the little buffer thing. That's the most important principle for them. And they'll do just about anything to pull that off. In order to make that work, they have to have a super resilient system. They have to have a system that's even smart enough that when something doesn't quite work, in one region, because they use Amazon's regions, if it doesn't work here in Australia, then they'll switch to Singapore servers to actually deliver streaming video here on this continent. So they work really hard to make their system reliable. So they invested thousands of hours, I suspect hundreds of thousands of dollars in a way to make sure that their system is reliable. Does anybody know what that big investment is? What did they build? What was it? Chaos Monkey and Chaos Army. They built all this software to make sure that they build better software. And that's why they're so great at this, because that's what they did. At Amazon, they have a different value. At Amazon, their value is they want to create as many products as possible, minimum viable products, and get them up and launched and kill off the ones that don't make sense. They want to increase their averages. Now, a lot more tries means they could find more products. So they spend thousands of hours and lots of money on a system where if I get an idea, I come into the office on Monday, I can press a button, I can fill out a form, and I get a new product build. I get a couple of EC2 instances, I get a Jira list, I get a build pipeline, there's a little mailing alert list that's set up, all the things, templates, all this stuff ready for me to go in a repo, and then the last step, it tells my boss. And I love that that's the last step, right? One of the things I think we learned from Amazon, I think it was from somebody at Amazon, is if you want to be great, stop asking for permission, right? So they build their system so that if you've got a great idea, we want you to start on it right away. And just let me know. Now eventually, if I do this a few times and not much is happening, like I start a new one every week, my boss might come to my cube and she'll say, are you gonna complete something? Are you gonna? And that's what they do, right? But I don't have to ask to start. Do we know this Etsy shop, this sort of online store for crafters? At Etsy, their superpower is releasing. They release about 40 times a day to production. That's pretty amazing. And what they did is they built this entire system to let just about anybody in the company release to production. They have a sort of a protocol on a simple change, like maybe I need to get at least one other person to sign off and agree, and then we need to run the tests. There's a thing called writing an assertion, like how this is going to help, and then it's all automated, and eventually it gets sent out to some small part of my user base. They segment the base. But again, that's their superpower, so they spent time on that. So every one of us work at a company where there is actually this sort of super thing that would make us great. And companies that spend time and money making that powerful, making that easy for everyone, and they're actually engaging in this hedgehog idea. A company that I think is pretty good at this is a company called Twilio. Twilio their only product is an API, and it's basically SMS messaging, or now I think they do some voice and some other things. And what's cool about Twilio is Twilio doesn't actually send any SMS messages. They purchase service from AT&T and other phone companies and Telstra and so on and so forth. They purchase that. What they built is a great API. And they also know that developers are their secret sauce. So their whole program, the way they talk about it, is that you can do whatever you want to do without a lot of effort, and we're here to make that possible for you. That's sort of their power. The whole Twilio, the whole idea about how they design their APIs and how they document them and all that has this personality of like, we're going to help you with your passion. And I've worked with some Twilio evangelists in the past, and they have that same kind of passion about how what they do can help us in so many other ways. So I think they do a really good job at that. And it's really, in order to stay on top, you really need to be working in that little passion zone. You might turn out to be really good at something, better than most of the peers around you inside an organization, but if you're not really passionate about it, it's possible that somebody else will come along that will be even more interested in it. So passion is really a key driver for reaching this greatness. And the other side of that passion, that willingness to take time, or that willingness to dig into it, is this notion of discipline. And we've seen a lot of this. Collins calls it a culture of discipline. This ability to get in there and do the things that you need to do every single day. He has the example called rinsing the cottage cheese. If you really want to make really good cottage cheese, it turns out there's this step where you have to rinse it a lot to get all of the bitterness out and actually get it to taste really good and fresh. I'm not really a fan of cottage cheese, but I understand the concept. But it turns out it's a dull and boring and annoying and dirty and yucky job. But if you want to be great, you have to do that. And that's a really big part of doing things well, is doing the stuff that isn't romantic, that isn't exciting, that isn't interesting, but you do it over and over. I worked with a gentleman for a while by the name of Steve Klabnik. Steve is a great evangelist, a great speaker on APIs, and he's been involved in a handful of standards. And he worked for a company for balance payments for a while, and he helped build their API program. And he said the most important thing that he was able to do there is help them figure out how to be disciplined, how to do things over and over and over again. He kind of invented his own sort of test-driven development notion and sort of infused it not just into the way that they wrote tests or wrote code, but actually the way they deployed their entire system. And he got everybody really excited about paying attention to the small details and doing it over and over and over again. One of the things that he talks about is the idea of making the boring stuff easy so you can get on to something else. But he was really, really good at that. And balance payments, I'm not sure if they're actually, I think they got purchased, but they were one of the first sort of open banking API or open money management APIs about 3 or 4 years ago, before it got to be a big thing. And they sort of led the way on how that's done. And the way Collins talks about this is when you take that discipline and you marry that to that passion and that sort of creative idea, then you can really start creating something great. And I think Balance Payment did that really, really well. I think it's the same kind of thing that Twilio does. They're great at details as well. So creating something great is often just talking about discipline. And then there's this idea of technology accelerators. Now, from Colin's standpoint, in the late 80s, technology was this sort of extra thing. It was not really infused with the same kind of purpose and meaning that we have today. I had a great story. I think Gregor Hoppe will be here soon. He'll be coming back here soon. Gregor had moved from Google to Allianz Insurance, and he said he was kind of startled at Allianz. He said they would be talking about something that we were going to work on, a new banking product or a new there was an insurance company, and somebody would say at Allianz, you know, we should go talk to IT about that. And Gregor said, you know, at Google, nobody says that. They don't say, well, we should go talk to IT. Why is that? Because Google is IT, right? So Google, IT is the product. IT is not this added thing. It's not this extra thing. We don't apply technology to whatever the idea is. Google is technology. So I think Colin's view on this is actually pretty good. So he talks about using technology to be the accelerator. Pick your technologies so they get you further on to where you want to be and what you want to do. And sort of the backstory or the hidden message of this is, don't pick technology just for technology's sake. Don't become a camp follower. Don't just pick the latest thing because it's the latest thing. Figure out what it is you really need, you really want, and do that. And that can be challenging for us who are in the business of knowing what the latest and the greatest is. It turns out that all of the newest stuff is not always applicable to all the things that we might do. And maybe just a few teams need to be focusing on GraphQL and the rest of the company needs to be focusing on REST style or CRUD style. Maybe we have to maintain a really important investment in our SOAP services because that's where most of our partners are. Using the technology that's appropriate in order to meet the needs of that particular audience can be really the best way to go. And that's a lot of what Amazon is like. From what we were able to learn about Amazon's AWS and internal program and their APIs and how they build it, they're amazingly agnostic about a particular technology or a particular style of service or back-end or open source. They kind of don't care in their organization. If your team wants to use Kafka, fine. If they don't want to use it, fine. If you want to use some SQLite or you want to use MySQL, that's fine. If you want to use this editor, that editor, all they really care about is what comes out of the system. They say, as long as your group produces in the same interoperable format that we have, that's what they have a huge discipline on, is about the way things work interoperably, then that's just fine with us. You do whatever you want to do. They don't really care. So they don't really get excited about any new thing that comes along. The other thing, though, that's really interesting, and this is one of the reasons I picked their API for their gateway, is they're more than willing to try a technology. The API gateway actually uses a messaging format called HAL, or Hypertext Application Language. Has anybody heard of HAL before? So Amazon has been really willing to try something out. In matter of fact, in perfect Amazon style, they had an app streaming API. It had to do with some of their internal management for their workspaces and some app space applications. And when they released that API, they released it using a traditional sort of CRUD style interface and a HAL interface. They actually released it with two interfaces. And they watched to see which one people used and how it worked and how easy they were to maintain. And what they learned from that is that, hey, this HAL thing actually works pretty good. So this API that they released, they decided to only release with a HAL interface, right? So they did a little experimenting, they got some results, and they said, hey, people are interested, I'll use this technology. Now I can bet that if this doesn't work well, they'll just switch it to whatever works. Because that's really what they do. For them, a technology, a format, a library, all these other things are just an accelerator to their real goal, which is to help people solve their problems. That's what they're passionate about. The other thing that I love this line, culture eats strategy for breakfast. This is actually a version of a line from Peter Drucker, another business management person. And he said, and I love that they added, and technology for lunch, right? And then it actually eats the whole thing. So it's okay to use technology as an accelerator, but don't become just the technology. And here he talks about it. Thoughtless reliance, it just makes it a liability. So that's another big thing that I see organizations struggle with, and that is, well, we're going to convert a whole bunch of things, and we're going to actually use this brand new open source thing to do all of it. And that means that if the open source thing doesn't work out, our whole investment in that thing is not going to work out. In other words, they don't decouple the technology from the goal. If we want to migrate something, we're going to migrate it and we're going to apply this technology. That's pretty good. But if it turns out you become stuck, you can actually bet the whole company on one particular thing, that turns out to be a liability. And that's where I was really impressed about how Amazon would actually use multiple pieces of technology or multiple samples of this and see what's going to happen. That's really a thing that I think talks about greatness. And then the last one in his list is a thing called the flywheel principle. It has this added effect of small initiatives, of small efforts. If I push it just a little, it gets easier and easier and easier as I start to push it until pretty soon it's easy to keep it going. It's easy to get it going really fast. Most of us who work on development, we actually experience a version of this flywheel thing in our heads, right? You show up, you sit down at your terminal, you clear your head, you're about to get ready. It takes some time to start reading some documentations, looking at code that you checked in yesterday, maybe some other things, and then pretty soon you start get going. You sort of get into headspace. And it works really well, and you can actually be very effective at this. And things are working really, really great until somebody stops by your cubicle, right? And then they break your concentration, and it's like, yeah, whatever, blah, 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 we can do lunch, and so on and so forth. And then you turn around, you got to start again. You got to start working up, and working up, and working up, and finally you get into headspace again, and then the phone rings, right, or something. Microsoft figured this out very early on. At Microsoft, they had hundreds and hundreds of developers, and they wanted to make sure that they could focus and keep their focus for an extended period of time. So they built buildings where everyone had an office with a door. And it's just, I've been here, it's just rows and rows of these tiny little offices with the same door. And there's actually a piece of, a small glass window on the side. The door is solid. And it's just row upon row upon row, and you can get lost. It's like, it's really kind of weird. But the thing was, the rule is if you close your door, you don't want to be disturbed. People can't stop by. People aren't supposed to knock on the door. And that's your headspace. That's your time. They also have this weird thing where you can decorate inside there any way you wish. There were guys that had like black light posters and beanbag chairs and lots of other things. And there's not a lot of room. I mean, the office is like maybe that big, a lot of them had stand-up desks or whatever. But they sort of understood this notion of flywheel, of making things easier. A great example of flywheel are things like continuous delivery and continuous integration. And I love this quote from Jez Humble about incrementalism. If it hurts, do it more often, do it more frequently. Bring the pain forward. This is a really great message from this continuous delivery world. A handful of customers I work with are still in this notion where they release to production 4 times a year. It means you only got 4 shots in a year to get it right. And boy, if you don't get it right on one of them, now you're kind of really screwed, because now you're going to have to back everything up, and a lot of people are upset. But if you do this kind of continuous delivery experience, if you do this more often, you can actually you get 20 shots a year, 25 shots a year. If you're Etsy, you get 40 times a day, right? So it's really amazing. So what happens is, if you can just do a little, make it a little bit better, then the next time it's even easier to make it a little bit better and a little bit better. And that's a lot of what continuous delivery is about. It's about taking things in very, very small chunks to make it easy. This is how John Allspaw from Etsy actually explains this notion of making it easy. If you've only got 4 times a year, it's a big bet every single time. We're going to tell people you can't go on vacation, you have to come in on the weekend. It's going to be a really big thing, because we're going to shut the old system down Friday at midnight. We're going to have it all back up and running by Saturday, and hopefully you have all day of Sunday to fix the bugs, and when everybody comes in Monday, it's great. And it's a huge disruption of everyone's lives. And the thing is, if it screws up, you're really kind of cooked for another couple of months. But if you do it in small increments, there are lots of advantages. So first of all, every one of these big packages, maybe they have 150 changes in them. Mathematically, that means there's about 11,000 possible things that can go wrong just inside that package. Not counting how it affects everyone else, right? But if I can make it a smaller package, maybe there's only 10 things in it. Now there's only about 100 or so possible things that can go wrong. Orders of magnitude easier, right? So that's a big deal right there. So if something does go wrong, I have a decent shot at figuring out what that is. Also, if I have to back it out, it's easier. If I have to back it out, fewer people are affected. So I don't have such a big blast radius. I don't have such a big disappointment. So there's lots of advantages to doing it smaller. It turns out I may not actually get more done in a year this way, but I have a better likelihood of success. I have that flywheel effect. And in fact, it turns out, as Jez and Farley and others talk about when they talk about continuous delivery, as you build up this ability to do these in small pieces, it gets easier and easier and easier and easier and easier. And pretty soon, your pace, it's not just 2 weeks, you can be like Etsy. You can actually do it multiple times a day if you like. So that flywheel principle makes a lot of sense. There's this tremendous power in this ability to do just a little bit every single day. Tom and Mary Poppendieck, who brought Lean to software, have this idea. And they say, if you had to change one line of code in your system, how long before it shows up in production? Is it a day, a week, a month, an hour? That's your agility, that's your speed, that's your delivery speed right there. And if you can just shave a little bit of time off of that, that gets you closer and closer to doing great things. And when the cost of change gets cheaper and when the risk gets lower, you're more likely to try something different. You're more likely to try experiments that might get you from that good to great, because it's not such a big risk anymore. It's not betting the company every time you want to go into production. So I've talked about these principles, and I've talked about them sort of in these ways of API companies and tech companies. I love that Spotify has this notion of level 5 developers, of how developers can move up the ladder, how Netflix focuses on first getting the right people on the bus before they worry about where they're going, how Yegi was able to constantly confront the brutal facts and actually get praised for it inside his company, and how Twilio has this notion of really tapping into our passions, and how Balance Payments has this discipline, this idea that we can do the little things and it makes a difference, and how Amazon is willing to try whatever technology makes sense for it to get to its goals and what it wants to do. And finally, that Etsy teaches us so much about how just incrementalism, little bits of things, help you reach a greatness that you might not normally get. And I think these are just really, really powerful. So I have a sort of a Steve Jobsy one more thing kind of deal for this. Remember this thing when we talked about this this idea of capable and team members and managers and contributing and stuff like that? I thought about this and I said, can I directly translate that into a kind of an API pyramid? Can I come up with level 5 APIs? What would those be about? And my colleague, Ronnie Mitra, who works in the API Academy, has done a lot of research on usability and human-computer interaction and these other things, and he has a lot of this. So I'm going to kind of steal from some of the things that he's taught me and kind of extend on it a little bit. So at sort of the level 1 API, you have an API that's functional. It works. It's good. It's okay. A little hard to use. Not so much fun. I can't believe they did it this way. I guess it works, right? We all have these experiences where, yeah, it's okay. I really prefer they did something else. And you can go beyond that just plain functionality to something that is reliable. It's not only does it work, but at least it's consistent and it works all the time. And it's pretty effective. It's decent. It actually, I feel pretty good about this. I have some good confidence in this. I feel a little better about this. Even more importantly, I have an API that's easy to use. It isn't just functional, it isn't just reliable, but it's pretty easy to use. It's actually hard to screw up with this API, right? We all know products that we just sort of say, you know what, this product kind of understands me. This is exactly how I think this ought to work. We also know apps where we just get really pissed. Like, what do you mean I just deleted all my contacts? That button's too small. You know, we all have these experiences. And when we're working inside an organization, we're designing APIs for either our team members or for partners or customers. They have the same experience with our APIs. Like, I can't believe you made it so easy for me to delete the database. And there's no backup, there's no undo. And past usable is actually pleasurable. Like, this is fun. Like, I love doing this. As a matter of fact, I love it so much, I'm going to tell my friends at the next meetup about this API that I use. And that starts to get really powerful, for suddenly, now this API actually makes me feel good. I like working with this. Matter of fact, I think I want to learn more about this language or more about this technology because this is really interesting to me. And I'll start to share this with lots of other people. Now I might even get passionate about it. But so even beyond that is not only do I like doing this, but I've done a lot of this, and there's nobody that does this better than them. Right? So suddenly I'm creating an API that nobody can do as well as we can. I'm actually starting to turn this in. What in the world happened there? I guess I got an update. That's a bad API. So I like this idea that there are levels to this for a handful of reasons. We all start somewhere on this chart. Our organization is always somewhere on this chart. And for most of us, there's still a lot of headroom. There's still a lot of opportunity. And there's still a lot of ways we can think about it. And the way Ronnie taught me this kind of thing about usability and functionality and experience is you're always thinking about it from the user's point of view, from helping them solve their problem. How do they feel about using it? How do they feel about using the work that I do? And I love that. That really kind of touches into that doing hard work and being humble. It's not about me, but it's about you. So I think there's lots of really cool things in this notion and ways to think about this. I'm going to mention, I really love this book, Designing for Emotion by Aaron Walter. It's this idea about how do I get beyond just something that's functional, but something that makes people feel really good. A lot of human-computer action is about how we touch emotions, how people feel about what this is. This is also becoming a really big thing in the AI space or in the bot space. We talk about all these things where people might feel kind of creeped out about how computers start to interact with us, but sometimes we actually feel pretty good. We feel pretty okay about this, and actually it can be pleasurable. So how can we design for that? How can we design past just functional and usable into that space where people really get passionate and excited? And this last quote from Collins I'm going to add because I really like this quote. Basically, you can accomplish anything if you don't care who gets credit. And it goes right back to Colin's first thing about how you want to work hard and be humble. And the challenge for me when I travel is often the people I would love to talk to more and more are the people who have this kind of attitude, and often they're the ones standing off to the corner, they're in the back of the room, they're not the ones up in front of the room speaking, they're the humble ones. So you have to look for them. And you probably have them in your company. You probably know who they are. Who are the ones that work hard and are humble? And they probably have a lot to teach all of us about how to turn something from good to great. And I hope you can find those people inside your organization and that you can start doing that same thing. So that's what I have. I want to thank you very much for listening. Thanks. Turn it over to you. Do we have some time for questions?
Yeah, we've got a bit of time for questions.
Okay, I'd be happy to answer any questions about this or possibly other things. I don't want to open it up and be responsible for anything, but is there any questions at all? I'd be happy to share. Comments, maybe you have examples in your own experience about some of these things we talked about as well. Anything? Anyone? Yes?
A question about the example you gave with Amazon, how you said they don't care what tools you use as long as you get the outcome. So how do they manage the development process and make sure that, and make things maintainable if everyone's doing a little bits and things? Is it like shared accountability?
Yeah, so the question was, I talked about Amazon and how Amazon kind of doesn't care too much about the technology that you and your team ends up using. Is that manageable? How do they deal with the variance, and how do they deal with that? The way they explain it to us is they offer us a sort of a set of tools, like a common way of doing things, and they allow the teams to make their own decisions if they want to go off book, if they want to do something else. There are some basic rules about staying within the guardrails. There's some security checks, there's some other things, licensing issues. But for the most part, they don't focus a lot about the inside of a team. As a matter of fact, the things we hear about Amazon is Amazon teams are fairly black boxy. You can't really see too much inside a team. They might use a different language than another team, and so on and so forth. So they really govern that shared understanding between parties, rather than they do what happens inside the box. The line that Werner Vogels shares about this whole idea is, you built it, you own it. So it's okay if you don't want to use the stuff we suggest. If you want to use something else, just know that you're the one that's responsible. So that's sort of the way the culture kind of works there. The impression that we get is that it's pretty much a very competitive culture. You're free to be as creative as you want. You just have to make sure you produce as expected. And so that's pretty much the pattern. We're also told when we talk to people there that there is lots of actual duplication of things. People will fork things and have their own copy, and as long as they maintain their own copy, they don't care that there's lots of duplication. So that's just kind of the culture that Amazon has. I would find that pretty challenging to work in myself, I think. I guess maybe at a team level I'd like it, but if I was responsible for understanding larger bits of it, it'd be kind of tough. But I think that just seems to be working well for Amazon right now. It's a good question, yes?
The design of an API is focusing on the solution. Can you comment on how important it is to understand the domain, the problem, first of all? And in terms of that, something like a CQRS, where the domain is thought in terms of commands rather than specific APIs?
Yeah, so if I understand it, it's like a lot of the things I talked about were very product-oriented or sort of solution-oriented, right? And what you're asking about is sort of this idea of a problem domain space, or something that might not be the end solution. There's some other kind of solution, like CQRS solves a different kind of problem. Is that kind of the way you're thinking about this? Or?
Before you design a solution, you should understand the problem, the domain, and
yeah.
Drives that in different designs. So that's sort of
yeah, so we can talk a little bit about that, sort of understanding the problem before you start the solution. A lot of organizations that I end up talking to, many of the parts of the system that they're building, they don't actually understand the problem that the final solution is solving. In other words, they're actually building infrastructure or framework for other people to create solutions to solve problems. That's, for example, that's really Amazon's motive, right? At the same time, each one of them has their own responsibility for a domain, right? So if our domain is data, if our domain is messaging, if our domain is managing users or something, we have our own ubiquitous language. We have our own domain understanding that we have to be consistent in. So it's this sort of coherence, cohesion challenge, right? And a thing like CQRS turns out to be a technology that I can use inside solving that domain, right? So just because I want to separate commands and queries and stuff like that is really just a technological element to solving the problem. Now, if it turns out my job is actually creating CQRS systems for others to use, that would become my problem domain. So I find it kind of interesting that several of these organizations have this notion of creating building block systems in order for somebody else to create solutions for. That means they're in a world where they don't know the problem that they're being used to solve. Now, Netflix is not like that. Netflix has a shared understanding from top to bottom. They have some people in the baseline of the organization that do things like we do operations, we do release, we do data management. But their language of their business is pretty simple. Etsy's the same way, Twilio's the same way. So making sure you sort of have this idea of what our domain is and whether or not that domain is just the all-encompassing one or it's some subset part is definitely can be a challenge. What I find really interesting is One of the things that we're starting to see as people are spending more time in this smaller service space and this more sort of context boundary space, we learned from a couple organizations is it turns out that the boundaries change over time. It turns out that what made sense to release in this clump probably needs to be released in 2 clumps because now we have to scale something more than we did last time. So it isn't so much one of the things that Martin Fowler has pointed out and some other people have pointed out is the best way to do a great context boundary or great domain design is to already know know the design and know the system before you actually build this. And that's really an example of System 1 and System 2 from Brooks. This idea that the first system you build, you learn an awful lot. It's not always the best one, so you build a second one that's better. Right? And we all experience this. We all experience rebuilds, redesigns. So there's certainly that part of it. But I think what happens is there's also System 3 and System 4 and System 5. We learn from each release. And I think one of the things that makes sense is that's why incrementalism is so powerful, because I get to release another one tomorrow. I get to fix it a little bit tomorrow. Hopefully that comes close to what we're talking about. Yeah. Others? Yes? Yes.
On this subject of TDD and API, you mentioned briefly about the Chaos Monkey.
Mm-hmm.
Have you come across people who put the two together? Where they design their API for failure rather than designing it for success primarily? It's going to work all the time.
Oh, if I understand the question, the answer is yes. So actually Netflix does that, right? Netflix designs their system based on this idea of type 1 and type 2 safety. Do we know this? Eric Holnagel, who's kind of a hero of the DevOps movement, talks a lot about root control or causes of errors and that kind of thing. He actually works not just in the IT space, but with hospitals and nuclear power plants. How do you make them safe? And there are 2 key forms of doing this. Type 1 safety is I find all the bugs and I remove them. I spend the effort to remove them. And the type 2 safety is I remove as many as I can, but I add more into the system to survive any bugs that I haven't found. Right? So type 2 safety is I'm going to survive. There's a book called System Antics. System Antics. And I forget the name of the author, but one of the quotes from that book is, great systems, reliable systems, continue to operate even in failure mode. So even when things are failing, they keep working. And we know lots of examples of this in real life, like airplanes, right, and nuclear power plants, and a lot of times cars, and all sorts of other things. They continue to work even when parts of the system go down, through its redundancy or some other thing like that. So there are lots of pretty good examples of that, and we definitely have companies that focus on this idea. There's a great book by Michael Nygaard. Michael Nygaard is also going to be a guest, right?
Yes, for Yao Perth.
For Yao Perth, and he has a book called Release It. Has anybody seen this book, Release It? It's a great book. And he has this section in it about basically releasable software needs to be resilient software. And he has a whole section on what are called stability patterns and capability patterns. So stability patterns are things like circuit breaker, bulkhead, handshaking, fail fast, timeout, steady state, all these sort of patterns to help you continue to work, continue to survive, protect yourself from other things, as well as survive bugs from other places or even bugs in your own system. One of the comments that Michael makes in that book is that it turns out you often spend more time coding for resiliency than coding for functionality. Right? So here's a whole book that talks about how to do this. He's actually in its 2nd edition right now. So I think especially those of us who are starting to work in microservice space where there's more network, there's possibly more network time than there is compute time in what we're doing, then we're also doing this idea of designing for failure. What's the Nassim Taleb book? There's a book that's sort of based on this.
Anti-fragile?
What is it?
Anti-fragile.
Anti-fragile, right? And Nassim has an even sort of next level way of thinking about this. And that is that ability to survive in a bit of chaos actually makes you stronger, actually makes you better. You get to learn from that. So I don't quite I don't know quite how to translate that into IT, but I'm pretty sure the Anti-Fragile book is the one that is one of the books they hand out at Netflix to their new engineers. So this is definitely, you're hitting on like a really important space. It could be as we start to get more AI to start adjusting how things work together, that's where that learning is, that that difficulty, that friction, that trouble, that set of bugs actually strengthen systems. They learn how to kind of repair themselves. So that's another possibility. It's a good question. Very good. Anything else? We doing okay? Yes? All right, well, I just want to say thank you very, very much. I've had a great time, and I'm going to turn it back over to Amy. Thank you. Thanks. Yep.
I was going to say another round of applause for Mike, but you guys were already on top of it. Thank you, Mike, for coming along tonight, all the way to Perth.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
We literally, it's not, I think Canada is literally, there's a city in Canada that's literally as far from Perth
Really?
as you can get.
Huh?
It's the furthest away. Yeah, one of my friends moved there last year. He's like, literally cannot get further away from Perth. So thank you for coming all of this way.
Absolutely.
Are you here for much longer?
I will be here through Saturday. So we'll have the workshop tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then I get Friday off. So I think I'm going to go to Rottnest, I think. Get on the ferry, pet something. I think. Is that what I'm supposed to do, huh? Yeah, right? I'm supposed to do that, right? And maybe.
You had summer for a couple of days and
Yeah.
now it's winter. So
Yeah. I get everything, right?
basically all we have in Perth.
Yeah.
It's either hot and sunny or it's cold and
Yep.
So yeah, make sure you take a selfie with the quokka.
All right, I'll do that and share it. Yep.
You're just not allowed to do quokka soccer.
Oh, yes. I would never do that. Absolutely. Wow.
We actually use quokkas so when I was at Yale Brisbane last year, when there were speakers that we saw that were really cool and I wanted to come to Perth, one of my friends who I was there with, we'd go around and we'd show them quokkas and they'd be like, oh my goodness, this is so cute. How do we see them? I was like, well, you're over here, you talk to those people and tell them you want to come to Yale.
Very cool.
So yeah, great for getting people to come in. Thank you very much for coming along.
Thanks.
Great talk, very much looking forward to your workshop tomorrow.
Yep.
And I'm sure you're very much looking forward to having a break after
Yeah, I'll enjoy
days
it.
of workshop.
It'll be fine. We'll have a good time tomorrow. It'll be
Yeah.
good. Yep.
That's very impressive. That you must be exhausted. You hanging around or?
Yeah, I'll hang around. Yeah, I'll be around. Yeah.
So everybody's free to
Yeah.
head back out and have a bit of
Yeah.
mingle, have a chat, or you can go home.
Yep.
But there will be people here. What time do we get kicked out of the building? Some security's not here, so yeah.
Midnight. Oh, we're fine.
We're not sure. Let's find out.
Yeah.
So yeah, feel free to go out and have a chat to people. Thanks for coming along tonight, and hopefully I will see more people on the 10th of May for the next one.
Excellent. Thanks. Thanks.